In the summer of 1925, the sprawling oil fields of Oklahoma were alive with the promise of wealth, the air thick with the scent of crude dust, and the unrelenting heat of the sun beating down on steel derricks and crude wooden shacks. The boom had transformed the region, drawing men from every corner of the country, each with dreams of striking it rich, each carrying a story, a past, a secret. Among the workers was a small group whose names would soon appear in headlines, whispered in local saloons, and carved into the collective memory of a state already shaped by hardship, ambition, and human folly. The oil fields, usually a place of commerce and labor, became the stage for a series of violent events so shocking that they seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the ordinary lives of those who toiled under the sun. The story begins with a single figure, a man both respected and feared among his peers, whose calm demeanor concealed a darkness no one could have anticipated. He moved through the camps quietly, observing the routines of others, engaging in conversations that appeared benign, yet beneath the surface, intentions simmered, meticulous and deliberate. The first signs were subtle, a whispered rumor here, a missing tool there, small disputes that escalated in inexplicable ways. Co-workers noticed tension in glances exchanged across the fields, unease that could not be easily explained. It was the kind of fear that builds slowly, creeping into conversations at night, seeping into the consciousness of the community until it became impossible to ignore. Then the first murder occurred. The victim was discovered in a backfield near one of the older derricks, his body arranged with an almost ritualistic attention to detail, the scene silent but screaming with the horror of sudden violent death. Panic spread through the camps, workers leaving shifts early, doors barred, the normally bustling oil fields enveloped in a surreal stillness. Newspapers seized upon the story, printing lurid details and eyewitness accounts that painted a landscape of suspicion, dread, and disbelief. The initial shock was compounded by the mystery of motive, the meticulous nature of the acts, and the realization that someone capable of such violence walked among them, unseen and undetected. Each subsequent murder intensified the fear. Patterns began to emerge, subtle at first. Bodies left near machinery, small items removed from the scene, cryptic signs that seemed to mock any attempt at understanding. The oilfield workers, men accustomed to danger, recognized the unprecedented nature of the events, and even the most hardened felt a creeping sense of helplessness. Local authorities were called in, their investigation hampered by the vastness of the oil fields, the isolation of certain camps, and the reluctance of witnesses to speak out. Fear of retaliation and disbelief of what could be taking place in their midst created an environment where speculation ran rampant. Whispers of organized crime, personal vendettas, and even the suggestion of something more ritualistic circulated alongside the official narrative, merging fact and fear into a tapestry that blurred reality. The intensity of the story lay not only in the murders themselves, but in the psychological tension they created, a pervasive dread that penetrated the day-to-day lives of everyone in the region. Workers began to travel in groups, fences and makeshift barriers were erected, and even routine activities carried an edge of anxiety. Every shadow, every sound became suspect, and the ordinary labor of the oil fields was now infused with an undercurrent of silent terror. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered details of relationships, rivalries, and personal histories that added layers of complexity and human intrigue to the unfolding horror. Neighbors spoke of arguments, debts, jealousies, and grudges, piecing together a portrait of tension that had been simmering long before the first death. Yet nothing in these histories could have prepared them for the methodical, deliberate cruelty that marked the crimes, nor for the psychological manipulation that would become apparent in the aftermath. It was as if the very ground of the oil fields carried the echoes of the violence, a haunted geography where human ambition and human depravity collided. For the nation, already fascinated by stories of frontier danger and industrial boomtowns, the Oklahoma murders represented a convergence of familiar and unthinkable, the ordinary rhythms of work and community interrupted by acts that defied comprehension. Local newspapers chronicled each death with meticulous detail, but their prose could not capture the pervasive unease, the way the fear seeped into homes, schools, and churches, coloring every interaction and conversation. The story at its core was not simply about murder. It was about the fragility of trust, the ease with which power and control could be abused, and the terrifying realization that even in the most mundane environments, darkness could take root. This case would go on to dominate headlines, inspire whispered tales for decades, and leave a legacy of both mystery and caution. The calm surface of daily life in the Oklahoma oil fields had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a tense vigilance, a creeping paranoia, and an unsettling knowledge that the ordinary men and women of the region could be swept into the orbit of horror at any moment. In this way, the oilfield murders of 1925 were not just crimes. They were a psychological shockwave, a reminder that human behavior, when combined with isolation, ambition, and secrecy, could produce results both incomprehensible and horrifying, lingering long after the final body was discovered. The Oklahoma of 1925 was a state still in the throes of rapid transformation, a place where the oil boom had reshaped the landscape, the economy, and the social fabric in a matter of years. Frontier towns that had once been quiet agricultural outposts had become bustling hubs of industry, with derricks and pumping stations punctuating the horizon and small wooden shacks housing workers and their families. The promise of wealth drew men and women from across the United States, from the neighboring Plains states to the Deep South, each carrying hopes, skills, and personal histories that intersected in complex ways with the emerging oil economy. Life in these towns was physically demanding, socially fragmented, and psychologically taxing, creating conditions ripe for both ambition and conflict. The rapid influx of workers outpaced the development of law enforcement and civic infrastructure, leaving many areas underregulated and vulnerable to exploitation, crime, and human error. Social hierarchies emerged quickly, based on access to capital, skill with machinery, and personal influence, but they were fragile, shifting with every new discovery of oil or sudden downturn in production. Within this context, laborers toiled long hours in dangerous conditions, often with minimal oversight, exposed to toxic fumes, crude equipment, and the unpredictable rhythms of a nascent industry. Accidents were common, from machinery malfunctions to falls from scaffolding, yet fatalities were often accepted as part of daily life. Communities were closely knit in some respects, bound by mutual dependence and the shared dangers of work, yet socially stratified, with tensions between newcomers and longtime residents, between supervisors and laborers, and between different ethnic or regional groups. Cultural expectations, shaped by both Southern traditions and frontier pragmatism, emphasized personal resilience, independence, and reputation, creating pressures to conform outwardly even as private resentments simmered. The oil fields themselves were a paradoxical environment, spaces of both opportunity and isolation. Workers often lived in makeshift camps or boarding houses, segregated by gender, occupation, or origin. The monotony of daily labor was broken only by small social gatherings, brief trips to local towns, or sporadic visits from relatives. In these conditions, tensions could escalate quickly, conflicts could be hidden and festering, and personal vendettas could flourish unnoticed. Isolation amplified both ambition and suspicion, creating an environment where seemingly minor grievances could evolve into serious threats. The lack of formal policing or investigative oversight meant that interpersonal conflicts often escalated unchecked, with informal justice and retaliation becoming part of the social landscape. Economic conditions also played a critical role. The oil boom generated wealth for some, but instability for many, with fortunes rising and falling overnight. Labor disputes, wage disagreements, and competition for limited positions intensified stress within the community. Workers' livelihoods were directly tied to the success of oil extraction, making them simultaneously ambitious and precarious, often pushed to extreme behaviors in order to secure stability or gain advantage. This volatility created fertile ground for violence, as men and women navigated both the demands of their labor and the pressures of survival, with few safety nets or institutional supports. Cultural norms of the era influenced perceptions of authority, morality, and justice. Patriarchal structures governed households and work environments alike, emphasizing obedience, hierarchy, and control. In the oil fields, where the physical dangers of the work were matched by social and moral pressures, these dynamics manifested in intense loyalty, suspicion of outsiders, and sometimes brutal enforcement of rules. Communities expected conformity to both legal and social codes, Yet the fluidity and anonymity of the boomtowns provided space for extraordinary behavior to go unnoticed until its consequences became unavoidable. The interplay between these societal norms and individual psychology is central to understanding the oilfield murders of 1925. Technological and environmental factors further shaped life and tension in the oil fields. Heavy machinery, flammable crude oil, and extensive networks of derricks created both opportunity and danger, with every accident potentially lethal. The smell of oil permeated living quarters. The constant roar of machinery created a background of stress, and the heat of the plain sun intensified fatigue and irritability. The environmental hazards interacted with social pressures to create a landscape in which fear, resentment, and ambition could combine into destructive force. Isolation, noise, and physical danger created psychological conditions that heightened anxiety, vigilance, and the capacity for both deliberate and impulsive violence. Law enforcement in Oklahoma at the time was limited in both reach and resources. Sheriffs and constables were often responsible for vast geographic areas, with minimal personnel and limited investigative capability. Formal judicial mechanisms existed but were slow, inconsistent, and susceptible to influence by wealthier actors or powerful families. In such a context, crimes could go unreported, uninvestigated, or misattributed, creating an environment where violence and secrecy could coexist with relative impunity. For workers in the oil fields, this reality fostered a sense of both vulnerability and self-reliance, with justice often administered informally or deferred entirely to chance. The combination of frontier conditions, economic instability, social isolation, and nascent industrial development created a volatile environment. It was a place where ambition and greed, fear and loyalty, secrecy and suspicion could coalesce into a perfect storm. Within this framework, the actors involved in the 1925 oilfield murders were operating not only within a physical and social landscape that facilitated extraordinary actions, but also within psychological and cultural parameters that intensified the consequences of every choice. The murders did not occur in a vacuum. They were the culmination of intersecting pressures of environment, culture, and human behavior, and their impact would ripple through communities long after the events themselves. The first incident occurred in the early hours of a hot Oklahoma morning when a worker named Thomas Clayton failed to report for his shift. His colleagues initially assumed he had overslept or traveled to a neighboring camp, but concern quickly grew when the smell of oil and the metallic tang of blood reached the edge of the derrick where he was last seen. A search revealed his body sprawled near the base of a rusted pump, an unnatural stillness in the sweltering air that immediately silenced the nearby men. Witnesses described an eerie calm, the sun rising over the field casting long, dark shadows, as if the very landscape had conspired to hide the horror. Thomas bore multiple lacerations, precise and deliberate, each wound a statement of methodical violence. The community was shaken. This was no ordinary accident. Rumors began to circulate about rivalries over claims and the possibility of vengeance taken with an almost ritualistic attention to detail. The second death followed days later. In the absence of formal oversight, workers became increasingly cautious, traveling in pairs and glancing warily at every shadow. Mary Fletcher, a cook employed in one of the larger camps, discovered the body of another man, Samuel Green, in a makeshift storage shed. The scene was unnerving. Tools had been removed, objects arranged meticulously, and the victim positioned unnaturally, his expression frozen in surprise and terror. The meticulous arrangement suggested forethought, a deliberate choreography that elevated the crime from spontaneous violence to psychological terror. Camp residents whispered that someone was orchestrating the killings with knowledge of both the land and the routines of its inhabitants. Fear began to infiltrate daily life. Conversations were shortened, doors barred earlier, and shadows in corners of rooms became sources of suspicion and dread. A third incident took place during a violent thunderstorm. When lightning split the sky and rain turned the fields into a sea of mud, a worker named Joseph Ramsey was found beneath a derrick, his body partially submerged in slick oil. Witnesses reported a sense of unnatural silence, a hush that descended even upon the storm, broken only by the distant boom of machinery and the pounding rain. The wound patterns were inconsistent with accidental falls, showing deliberate force, precision, and cruelty. The psychological impact on the workforce intensified. Men began to suspect each other, friendships strained under suspicion, and the collective anxiety made routine tasks feel perilous. The oil field, once a place of opportunity and ambition, had become a landscape of quiet terror, where every creak of machinery and every sudden movement could signal impending death. In the following weeks, the incidents escalated in both frequency and complexity. A fourth victim, Leonard Watkins, was discovered in a tool shed with multiple puncture wounds that suggested a struggle. The placement of objects, the precise angles of the wounds, and the almost ritualistic nature of the scene indicated a perpetrator not only skilled but intentional, someone using fear as a weapon as much as violence. Neighbors spoke of seeing shadowy figures moving between camps, noting unnatural behaviors and strange patterns in otherwise mundane tasks. Community tension grew unbearable. The psychological pressure was palpable, a quiet horror that lingered even when no one was actively threatened. Subsequent murders revealed an evolving pattern. Victims were discovered in locations connected to their daily routines, yet altered in subtle, terrifying ways. A man named Harold Jenkins was found atop a wooden catwalk, a rope inexplicably draped nearby, suggesting a staged accident. A young laborer, Vincent Miller, was found in a storage pit, his body arranged to mimic a fall from machinery, though forensic examination of the time, limited as it was, indicated otherwise. Each act combined practical knowledge of the oil field environment with a calculated intention to maximize psychological impact on those who remained. Workers began avoiding certain areas, assembling in groups and developing codes of communication to report suspicious behavior. Fear had infiltrated every corner of the fields, leaving even experienced men on edge. As the investigation progressed, subtle evidence began to emerge. The perpetrator displayed knowledge of workers' schedules, routines, and personal conflicts, selecting moments of vulnerability with uncanny precision. Tools were sometimes removed from scenes, items rearranged, and symbolic gestures left behind that suggested both meticulous planning and an understanding of the psychological impact of the murders. Observers noted a pattern of isolation, timing, and staged presentation, emphasizing both control and terror. Those who lived and worked in the oil fields began to perceive an invisible force, a presence manipulating events from the shadows. Ordinary labor became fraught with anxiety, and even casual interactions carried an undertone of suspicion. The community's response became intertwined with the incidents themselves. Rumors of secret alliances, personal vendettas, and even supernatural involvement spread as anxiety reached a fever pitch. Workers altered routines, travel patterns, and social behaviors. Doors were bolted, camps monitored constantly, and even trusted colleagues became sources of potential danger. The psychological tension was as lethal as the physical acts themselves. Fear, uncertainty, and suspicion infiltrated every aspect of daily life. The oil field, once a space of economic possibility, had transformed into a theater of dread, a place where human ambition intersected with extraordinary human malevolence. Throughout these events, the perpetrators remained largely unseen, their motives obscured by layers of calculation, secrecy, and the chaos of an oil boom town. Each incident built upon the last, creating a narrative in which the ordinary and extraordinary collided, forcing the community to confront both human violence and its own vulnerability. Observers, scholars, and later historians noted that the combination of isolation, occupational danger, and psychological tension created conditions in which extreme behaviors could flourish unchecked. The horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the way they reshaped perception, behavior, and social norms. By the end of the series of murders, the Oklahoma oil fields were marked by both tragedy and legend. Workers, authorities, and townspeople were left grappling with a profound sense of unease. Every shadowed corner, every tool shed, every derrick carried with it the memory of violence and the possibility of repetition. The sequence of incidents demonstrated not only the vulnerability of isolated communities, but also the capacity for calculated human cruelty to exploit environmental and social conditions. In the quiet spaces between machinery, in the dimly lit boarding houses, and under the relentless sun, the psychological imprint of fear persisted, haunting the oil fields long after the final body was removed. The murders in the Oklahoma oil fields sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the surrounding communities, extending far beyond the immediate camps where the tragedies had occurred. Families of the victims were thrust into the spotlight, navigating grief while simultaneously facing an unrelenting scrutiny from neighbors, journalists, and local authorities. Each household reacted differently. Some withdrew entirely, barricading themselves behind locked doors and boarded windows, their fear palpable in every hesitant glance and measured step. Others struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy, sending their children to school, continuing work in the fields, and attempting to preserve routines that now seemed hollow under the shadow of pervasive terror. The psychological strain on these families was immense, as grief and fear combined with suspicion of anyone who might harbor knowledge of the crimes. Whispered rumors of insider involvement, secret alliances, and concealed vendettas created a social tension that persisted in conversations, letters, and public gatherings for months after the last murder. Local law enforcement faced enormous pressure to produce answers, their reputations and careers dependent on uncovering a perpetrator who had eluded even the closest scrutiny. Investigators meticulously examined crime scenes, spoke with laborers, and attempted to piece together a timeline from fragmented observations. Yet the vastness of the oil fields and the limitations of forensic techniques of the era complicated every effort. Officers were acutely aware of the psychological state of the workers and residents, recognizing that fear could distort perception, memory, and reporting. Each interview became a delicate exercise, balancing the need for information with the potential to inflame panic or inadvertently accuse innocent individuals. The authorities' presence was a double-edged sword. It reassured some, while reminding others that the violence could strike again at any moment. Pastors and community leaders were confronted with moral and spiritual questions that transcended the practical matter of stopping a killer. Sermons at local churches shifted to address the unpredictability of human evil, the fragility of life, and the necessity of moral vigilance. Clergy attempted to guide congregations through the collective trauma, offering explanations framed within religious doctrine while acknowledging the deep unease that permeated daily life. Discussions in churches, community halls, and informal gatherings oscillated between fear, theological interpretation, and attempts to rationalize the incomprehensible nature of the murders. Some neighbors turned to prayer as a means of coping, while others debated the ethical and social failures that had allowed such acts to unfold in plain sight. Newspapers capitalized on the sensational nature of the crimes, their headlines both informing and inflaming public perception. Reports were detailed, graphic, and often speculative, blending documented facts with conjecture to create narratives that captured the nation's attention. Journalists highlighted the extraordinary environment of the oil fields, the isolation of the camps, and the psychological pressure of frontier life, suggesting that these factors may have contributed to the unfolding tragedy. While the media coverage increased public awareness and created pressure for action, it also heightened fear, encouraging sensational rumors and spreading anxiety to neighboring towns and distant states. Readers debated whether the events were the result of personal vendettas, greed, psychological instability, or the influence of the harsh industrial and social conditions in which the victims and perpetrators lived. Within the oilfield community itself, social bonds were tested as suspicion grew. Long-standing friendships frayed under the weight of uncertainty, and casual disagreements escalated into accusations. Workers altered routines, avoiding isolated areas, pairing up during tasks, and conducting informal checks on one another. Ordinary activities such as tending to machinery, fetching supplies, or even eating in communal areas became charged with tension, the sense of imminent threat never fully dissipating. Observers noted the development of intricate social signaling, coded warnings, and mutual surveillance, demonstrating the community's adaptation to an environment where danger could strike unpredictably. Psychologically, the impact on residents was profound. Anxiety became a near-constant companion, manifesting in sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and a pervasive wariness of strangers. Accounts from the era describe men staring at shadows for minutes at a time, hesitant to enter unlit rooms and avoiding travel alone. Women reported feeling unsafe walking through camp areas, and children sensed the tension even before fully understanding the nature of the threat. Mental health, though poorly understood at the time, was clearly affected. The community's response to fear became both an adaptation and a symptom of trauma. Local doctors and medical practitioners began to encounter cases of unexplained stress reactions, palpitations, and fainting spells, attributing them to a combination of physical exhaustion, environmental hazards, and the psychological strain induced by the murders. The legal and scientific discourse of the time attempted to reconcile the inexplicable violence with contemporary understandings of human behavior. Psychologists and criminologists, though limited in number, speculated on the influence of isolation, environmental stressors, and industrial pressures in producing extreme antisocial behavior. Debates emerged around whether the perpetrator could be categorized as mentally ill, criminally calculating, or both, with some suggesting that the unique conditions of the oil fields acted as an incubator for abnormal behavior. These discussions, while academic in nature, filtered down to the local populace, influencing how the events were interpreted, remembered, and narrated. Despite law enforcement efforts, the response from the community reflected a combination of practical measures and psychological coping. Patrols were organized by groups of workers, neighborhoods monitored irregularly, and informal justice systems emerged, attempting to maintain a sense of safety. Social cohesion simultaneously strengthened and fractured as individuals negotiated between fear, loyalty, and the desire for self-preservation. Communities developed unspoken codes of conduct, reinforcing vigilance while trying to preserve some semblance of normalcy. Every interaction, every gesture, every absence became a potential signal of threat or alliance, illustrating the intense social recalibration required by an environment so saturated with danger and uncertainty. By the time the immediate wave of murders concluded, the Oklahoma oil fields were marked by a lingering tension that outlasted the investigations. Families remained cautious, neighbors maintained distance, and the collective memory of fear became part of the local identity. Social, psychological, and moral interpretations of the events persisted for decades, influencing folklore, local history, and the way subsequent generations perceived the land and the communities that had endured this dark chapter. The reactions of the community reveal not only the immediate horror, but also the enduring imprint of trauma on social networks, trust, and the perception of safety, a testament to the profound human consequences of violent and calculated acts within an otherwise ordinary industrial landscape. As the summer of 1925 deepened, the tension in the Oklahoma oil fields reached a breaking point. The quiet unease that had haunted workers and families for months crystallized into palpable fear, a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to settle over every derrick, shack, and muddy path. One sweltering afternoon, a group of laborers discovered fresh evidence near a remote pump station, far from the main camp, where the ground was churned into a slick of oil and mud. The sight stopped them in their tracks. Another body, partially obscured by equipment, its positioning deliberate, the wounds inflicted with the same meticulous cruelty as the prior victims. This discovery triggered an immediate response. Workers rushing to alert supervisors, authorities dispatched with unusual urgency, and the surrounding landscape transformed from ordinary industry to the stage of imminent confrontation. The investigation intensified. Officers combed the oil fields, moving methodically from camp to camp, examining every tool shed, supply depot, and wooden shack. Workers were questioned at length, their recollections overlapping, contradicting, and sometimes pointing toward inconclusive leads. Anxiety hung thick in the air, and the psychological weight of constant suspicion became nearly unbearable. Every creak of machinery, every distant shout, every rustle in the trees was interpreted as a potential threat. Those who had once walked confidently across the oil-slicked grounds now moved cautiously, alert to the possibility of sudden violence. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the late afternoon sun, and even their landmarks seemed distorted, as if the very landscape conspired with the perpetrator to amplify fear. A breakthrough came when evidence linked several incidents to a single individual whose movements had been carefully observed over weeks. Witnesses described moments of subtle interaction, a glance here, a casual remark there, revealing knowledge of routines and private grievances. Authorities began to focus on this man, piecing together a psychological profile that revealed both meticulous planning and a disturbing lack of empathy. The realization that one person could wield such calculated influence over life and death in the oil field struck fear not only into those directly involved, but into the broader communities dependent on the booming industry. The culmination of the investigation occurred on a humid, late summer evening when law enforcement, accompanied by a group of local laborers, confronted the suspect at an isolated derrick site. The air was thick with anticipation, every shadow cast by the towering steel structures seeming to conceal threat. As officers approached, the suspect's demeanor remained calm, almost unnervingly composed, his actions deliberate and controlled. There was no sudden violence, yet the tension was electric, a quiet terror punctuated only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional caw of a crow. Every movement of the suspect was scrutinized, every word measured. As the confrontation slowly unfolded into a standoff that tested both patience and nerve. The psychological dimension of this climax was as powerful as the physical danger. Workers and authorities alike felt the weight of accumulated fear, each aware of the potential for misstep, each recognizing the carefully orchestrated nature of the suspect's prior actions. The scene became almost cinematic in its intensity, a tableau of human tension played against the backdrop of oil-slicked earth and iron structures. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the failing light, and even minor noises, a clatter of tools, a snapping branch, triggered heightened vigilance. The suspect's calmness created unease in itself, a chilling contrast to the fear that had dominated the field for months. When the arrest was finally secured, there was a brief, tense period of relief, yet the impact of the murders lingered. Families began to process their grief in a more tangible way. Communities slowly resumed routines, and the oil fields, though still productive, bore the psychological scars of the events. For months afterward, workers recounted the details, revisited scenes, and speculated on motives, leaving a narrative of horror embedded in the collective memory of the region. The climax did not erase the terror, but instead crystallized it. A moment when danger was confronted, control was reasserted, and yet the shadow of what had transpired remained omnipresent, even after justice was formally administered. The psychological and social effects persisted. Residents of the oil fields were acutely aware that circumstances of environment, isolation, and opportunity had allowed such calculated cruelty to flourish. Discussions in community gatherings, letters to newspapers, and private reflections underscored the realization that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the vulnerabilities that had permitted it remained. This awareness created a lasting vigilance, shaping the behavior and expectations of those who remained and those who would follow. The climax of the 1925 oilfield murders demonstrated the intersection of human psychology, environmental pressure, and social dynamics, revealing a profound truth about vulnerability and resilience. It was a moment when the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary, when fear and courage collided, and when the consequences of human malevolence were confronted directly, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory. In that sweltering Oklahoma dusk, the events reached their dramatic apex, a sequence that combined investigation, confrontation, and psychological tension in a manner both chilling and unforgettable. In the weeks and months following the resolution of the oilfield murders, a fragile sense of normalcy began to return to Oklahoma's sprawling camps. Yet the psychological echoes of the violence lingered in ways that were both subtle and profound. Families rebuilt their routines, workers returned to their shifts, and machinery once again hummed in steady rhythm. Yet a pervasive unease remained, a quiet reminder that the events of 1925 had forever altered the social and emotional landscape. Conversations that had once been casual now carried undertones of caution. Trust was measured, suspicion lingered, and even the most mundane tasks were shadowed by memory. The oil fields themselves seemed to bear the imprint of the tragedies, each derrick, wooden walkway, and mud-slicked path a silent witness to the extraordinary acts of human cruelty and the psychological tension they had produced. Speculation about the murders persisted for decades. Scholars, historians, and folklorists debated the motives, the methods, and the environmental factors that had enabled such deliberate violence. Was the perpetrator a product of circumstance, shaped by isolation, stress, and social dynamics? Or did innate psychological pathology combine with the volatile conditions of the oil fields to create a perfect storm of malevolence? Some accounts suggested lingering shadows, whispers of strange behaviors, and minor incidents that mirrored the original events, blurring the line between historical fact and legend. Local folklore absorbed the narrative, turning real events into cautionary tales about ambition, secrecy, and the unpredictable consequences of human behavior in extreme conditions. The families directly affected carried their experiences in deeply personal ways. Survivors spoke of nights haunted by shadows, children affected by stories and silences, and adults who carried both grief and hypervigilance for the remainder of their lives. Mental health, though poorly understood at the time, was undeniably shaped by these events as chronic anxiety, sleep disturbances, and hyper-awareness became common among those who had witnessed or endured the aftermath. For the community, these murders became more than a sequence of crimes. They were a lens through which the fragility of life, the limits of human control, and the interplay between environment and behavior were starkly revealed. In the broader societal perspective, the oilfield murders highlighted vulnerabilities in industrial communities that were rapidly expanding and transforming. Isolation, lack of formal oversight, and social fragmentation created conditions where extraordinary acts could occur undetected, and the psychological consequences extended well beyond the immediate victims. Newspapers of the era, academic articles, and later historical accounts emphasized these dynamics, presenting the events as a case study in the intersection of environment, human behavior, and industrial expansion. Discussions in local schools, civic meetings, and informal gatherings reinforced the narrative, embedding the oilfield murders into a shared consciousness that straddled reality and folklore. Even decades later, the Oklahoma oil fields carried the weight of memory. New generations of workers and residents would sometimes pause when walking past the older derricks or tool sheds, aware that beneath the productive surface lay echoes of past horror. Local historians and storytellers recounted the murders with reverence and caution, emphasizing not only the events themselves but also the psychological, cultural, and social conditions that allowed them to occur. The story became both a historical record and a moral reflection, a reminder of human vulnerability, resilience, and the thin line between ordinary life and extraordinary darkness. Speculation persisted about whether the psychological imprint of the events had truly been resolved. Could extreme environmental stress, isolation, and social pressure provoke similar behaviors again? Were the murders merely a historical anomaly, or were they indicative of broader patterns inherent in human societies under duress? Such questions remained unanswered, leaving a lingering mystery that haunted both the landscape and the collective imagination. The epilogue of this story is not only a reflection on the crimes themselves, but also on the human capacity for fear, adaptation, and memory. Ultimately, the oilfield murders of 1925 became emblematic of the complexities of human existence in isolated, high-pressure environments. They demonstrated how ordinary people could be caught in the crossfire of circumstance and malice, and how communities adapt, remember, and attempt to heal. The events left an enduring mark on Oklahoma's history, a chilling reminder that even in seemingly ordinary landscapes, extraordinary darkness can take root, manifesting in ways that challenge both understanding and expectation. The legacy of the oilfield murders is a haunting reflection of human behavior, a narrative that resonates far beyond the time and place in which it unfolded, leaving echoes that endure in history, memory, and imagination.